Hello, everybody. My name is Brian Carpenter. I'm the curator of Indigenous materials here, and I run our Center for Native American and Indigenous Research. We are really glad that you're here today. I have a quick note just at the start about some housekeeping stuff. We have a conference document that has a lot of the information about questions you might have about various things. We have QR codes around for that. And I think in the online chat there will be information as well. We also are offering live Spanish interpretation. So a note for English speakers, because we're offering interpretation through Zoom, it's important to choose the English channel so you can hear the simultaneous translation into English when there are comments in Spanish. And that's important because we have a presentation in the afternoon that will be in Spanish, so you will want to turn that on for that one. If you're on a computer, you will find the globe icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can choose the channel there. On mobile and tablet, you will find it on the 3 dots on the side of your screen. Para los hispanohablantes, bienvenidos a nuestra reunión. Esperamos que la experiencia es muy bien para todos. Para acceder a la función de interpretación de Zoom, si está en su computadora, encontrará el símbolo de mundo en la parte de abajo de su pantalla que dice interpretación. Puede seleccionar el idioma allí y si no quiere oír el inglés, seleccione Mute Original Audio, silenciar el audio original. Si está en celular o en tableta, presione los 3 puntitos al lado de su pantalla para acceder a las opciones de audio y desde ahí accede a interpretación. I would like to get us started, to introduce Bob Hauser, the Executive Officer of the APS, for some welcoming remarks.
Welcome to this celebratory conference of the Center for Native and Indigenous Research at the APS. We're going to have a great 2 days enjoying CNAIR's 10th anniversary, and I'm glad that you joined us, whether in here in Benjamin Franklin Hall or virtually. For those joining us for the first time, the American Philosophical Society was founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1743 with the mission of promoting useful knowledge, which is still the mission today. Most of our nation's founders were members, and Thomas Jefferson was APS president for 17 years, during most of which time he was either vice president or president of the United States. Like the Constitution, the presidency, the Congress, and the courts, as a source and keeper of knowledge, the society was an essential piece of the bedrock on which our nation was founded almost 250 years ago. It remains so today. The society is a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership, of which I will say more later, honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to science, the arts, humanities, and public life. The Society promotes research by providing close to $2 million a year in research grants and fellowships, primarily to younger scholars and those in marginal appointments who need the support the most. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors around the globe. The Society also sustains and informs citizenry. We do that through our meetings, publications, exhibitions, conferences, influencing the influencers, and other outreach activities. While we at the Society continue to admire Franklin and Jefferson and other founding members for their key roles in the formation of this nation, for their leadership of the Society, and for their devotion to science, education, and other noble causes. We are also much aware of their faults, most significantly their slaveholding. In the wake of the 2020 murder of George Floyd, the APS joined many other institutions and individuals in assessing its role in perpetuating racism and injustice. Patrick Sparrow and I wrote an unsigned essay about the history of racism at the Society, which was published in the 2020 APS News. In fact, some members of the Society supported racist ideas and practices in three historical phases: the slaveholding of its founders, the scientific racism of the mid-19th century, and the eugenics movement of the 20th century. We at the APS are committed to sustaining the better parts of the Society's legacy while working towards a future of inclusion, diversity, equity, and access, the APS idea. At the American Philosophical Society, the collection and study of Native American language and culture is almost as old as the institution itself. Thomas Jefferson had a strong interest in Native American languages, and in many instances, including the Lewis and Clark expedition, he circulated a list of words that he thought would be common to all communities. And he asked people to write in the words that those other communities used. He assembled a large collection of these lists. He planned, after his presidency, to study similarities and differences among them, and thus create a history of native populations across North America. That project came to naught. On his way back from Washington to Monticello, his belongings were left on a barge in the James River at Richmond. Thieves stole the largest and heaviest trunk, thinking that it must contain valuables. When they found out that it was filled with paper, they dumped it in the river. The next morning, Jefferson found about a dozen scraps of paper on the riverbank, and they are now in the Society's collections. But that's all that was left. That would have been the end of the story, but one of Jefferson's great admirers was the French-born Pierre-Stéphane Duponceau, later Peter Stephen Duponceau, who had come to the colonies at the age of 16 to join the American Revolution as a military aide. He became a superb linguist, a lawyer, and much later president of the APS. Duponceau relaunched the collection and study of Native American languages and culture at the APS. And this was all before the middle of the 19th century. He also wrote a book about Native American languages published by the Society, but in French. I'm hopeful that the APS Press will one of these times publish an English translation. In brief, without Duponceau, there would be no APS collections of Native American linguistic and cultural materials and no CNAIR. While I have the stage, I want to mention another recent initiative of the APS that reflects our interest in and commitment to Native American communities. When I became executive officer, I learned that there was only one Native American among its members. That struck me as entirely wrong, both as a matter of justice and equity, but also utterly inconsistent with the outstanding contributions of many Native Americans. With my encouragement, the Society created what we call a temporary nominating group, a committee that was empowered to recommend the election of a Native American each year for 5 years, of which 4 have passed. In addition, I encourage the members of that committee to nominate other Native Americans through the regular process of election to the Society. There are now 8 elected Native Americans in the APS, and there will be more in 2025. In my opinion, that is not where the Society should be, but we are headed, I think, in the right direction. Thank you. And now I would like to introduce the director of the APS Library and Museum, Michelle McDonald. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Michelle McDonald. I am the director of the library and the museum here at the American Philosophical Society, and it is my very great pleasure to add my welcome to this conference presenters and attendees. To begin, we would like to rightfully acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides in Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, in both the past and the present. We also wish to acknowledge their continued presence and resilience despite centuries of land theft experienced through deceptions such as the walking purchase of 1737, multiple waves of removal, and sustained persecution of their language and ways of life. The American Philosophical Society has benefited from being an occupant of this part of Lenape land, now called Philadelphia. As an organization, founded literally next to the seat of colonial power in Pennsylvania, that has many founders and leaders who were officials, even presidents, for those colonial powers that expedited Indigenous removal. The Society recognizes the importance of speaking about this history honestly and carrying itself forward now in a spirit of welcome and collaboration. We value our relationships with contemporary Lenape communities, those we have cultivated and sustained for many years, and new ones that may emerge. We also wish to acknowledge the importance of this place, Philadelphia, in its long-standing use by the Lenape as a meeting ground where people from many Indigenous nations have long come to gather for diplomacy, discussion, and exchange. Those traditions began long before the arrival of European settlers, and they continue through the present, including in gatherings such as this one that brings us together for the next 2 days. Through its Center for Native American and Indigenous Research, the Society seeks to promote research that honors Indigenous knowledge, cultivates scholarship, and strengthens languages and cultural traditions. We express our sincere thanks for the past and the ongoing generosity of numerous Indigenous communities and individuals who have offered their guidance, their expertise, and opportunities for collaborations that have made this work possible. The next 2 days are a testament to what can happen through collaboration. We will hear about new methods for language instruction and revitalization, understandings of space, and relationships of archives to Indigenous communities. These subjects form the core of what CNAIR was established to support. But as important as the what are the who, the people presenting this work, as many of you come from Native communities that have engaged with the APS and with CNAIR for many years. This is not an academic exercise, or at least not merely an academic exercise, as the presentations are deeply researched. Instead, this is a reunion of community members, archivists, and scholars who came together beginning 10 years ago to rethink how institutions could and should collaborate with Indigenous communities. Over the next 2 days, we will find out how far we have come and consider a map that might tell us where we should travel next. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Michelle. I would like to start off some various things I'd like to mention by remembering some of the people who made all of this possible, especially those who are no longer with us. And I'd really like to tell stories about all these people all day long, but I can't do that today. But maybe we can do that together, those of us who knew some of them and people that you knew who you think of who've passed along. But I'd like to, among them, who've been key to CNAIR's history, first going counterclockwise here at the top is Tim Powell, who was the founding director of CNAIR, and the person without whom none of this would all happen. His warmth of spirit, his openness to so many people and patience and so many other things is the spirit that sort of pushes all of this along. And we want to honor him throughout our time together. Wendy Bissell was an elder of Tuscarora Nation, Turtle Clan, who's passed on. She was one of our founding elders of CNAIR. She was incredibly kind and generous and whip smart and really organized people together and is greatly missed. And we want to remember her very much. Roger Roulette, the great Roger Roulette, translator of Ojibwe, master speaker, who worked with so many, especially devoted his life to working with elder speakers, creating language resources, teaching Ojibwe, Anishinaabemowin. And he could crack some really great jokes too. And we've got lots of good recordings of him, lots of laughing. We miss him very much. Larry Aitken, the bottom right, an elder of the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, another of our founding elders, and one of Tim's mentors, one of the first people we got to know. He was also the founder of Leech Lake Tribal College, and he was formative in many of CNAIR's early, the sort of proto-CNAIR times as well. Wadey Akins, an elder of the Penobscot Nation, kind soul, good friend, and who was really devoted his later years of life to re-strengthening traditional Penobscot music and teaching new generations about that, and going through archives a lot to do that, and we learned so much from him. And last but not least is T.J. Holland from the Eastern Band of Cherokee, who was another one of our founding members of the CNAIR Advisory Board, and a great friend, and who's also, like Roger, told a lot of great jokes, and we miss him greatly. So we will have tomorrow also a moment to sort of together remember other people who you know who have passed, and we'll share some more information on the ways to do that. But if you just join me for a moment to remember all of these folks. Okay. In an event like this, there's more people to thank than I will possibly be able to remember, so I am mortified about forgetting this. But one thing I would like to do is to say, first and foremost, you are our guests. We want to make sure you have a good time here. We hope the food is good. If you have anything you need, you can let us know. And I also want to introduce a number of the people who are here, who are APS staff, who are working on many things behind the scenes today and for many months leading up to this. And if I forget anyone, I am dreadfully, I'm very apologetic. But this is in no particular order of people who are in the room. Brenna Holland, the Associate Director of Library Scholarly Programming. She has done tons of work. You've probably got, a lot of you gotten emails from her about logistical things. There are more details that she's taken care of than you can even know, that I don't know the half of it. So we're deeply appreciative of all her work. Thomas Johns, who works with Brenna as well, you met him at the front desk at registration. He's also a master of many logistics, particularly the hotel. Very, very thankful for all the work that Thomas has done. Ruth Rouvier in CNAIR, our engagement coordinator for NACI, she's in the back, among our folks in the back working on the, Ruth raised her hand, thank you, working on that help make sure that the digital experience is great for everybody. She also runs our Native American Scholars Initiative, and is a great person to talk to about fellowship opportunities and other things. Haley Dardar is in the back as well. She's helping us out with the overall digital experience for all our online attendees. And she's a great person to chat to here as well, about a great many things too. We're very appreciative of the work she's done. Jeremy Schoenrock is here at the APS, is also the master, making sure all of this stuff works. Deeply appreciative of that. I also want to call out Paul Sutherland, who's one of the archivists for Indigenous materials here at CNAIR. If you write in for reference requests, a lot of the digitization that you may have received is through Paul, and he does amazing things and is deeply knowledgeable about the collections. Also want to mention Karen Trope, who isn't with us today, but she's our senior reference archivist, one of our newest members here. And so many other people that I'm undoubtedly forgetting, but if you have any questions, if you're our guests here, please let any of us know, and we'll be very glad to help. I also want to thank Adriana Link, the previous inaugural Director of Scholarly Programming, who helped get this whole idea, this conference in motion about a year plus ago, and gave it all a push that got it all started and then handed it off, and we're really deeply appreciative of her good advice on many things. I also want to thank many of the founders and donors who led to CNAIR being here today. The very first person who was doing this work, even before Tim and I, was a man named Dathel Kendall, who was a linguist who worked in the APS collections going back into the 70s. He was the first person who hired me when I started here in 2008. Unfortunately, he passed on of leukemia just months into my starting here. But he set up all this information in motion. That was a lot of the digitization and grant projects that got this started. And we miss Dathel a lot. Tim Powell, who I've mentioned, followed in Dathel's footsteps and was our first director of the Native American projects here, and we'll have much more to say about Tim. The founding elders for CNAIR are Larry Aitken, who I just mentioned, from Leech Lake, Wadey Aikens, and Wendy Bissell, who I also just mentioned, and Tom Belt, who wanted to be here with us today, but couldn't, but we'll hear from him in a moment. Also the founder members of our Native American Advisory Board, now called the CNAIR Advisory Board. I want to acknowledge them: Bob Miller, TJ Holland, Jerry Sabloff, Regna Darnell, Vince Schiffert, who's here with us, Scott Stevens, Denise Zuni, and Charlie Greifenstein. Needless to say, all of this isn't possible without a lot of generosity of a lot of donors as well. Many of them APS members. There are more to thank than I can even list here. I want to especially acknowledge them, as well as the National Endowment for the Humanities, who is very key of the Challenge Grant to make the CNAIR endowment possible, to make CNAIR a permanent part of what the APS does. And all of that wouldn't be possible without directors of development who help to coordinate all those things. In the years from CNAIR's beginning through now, I want to especially acknowledge Nanette Holbein, Molly Roth, Linda Jacobs, and the director of the Friends at APS, Alexis Anderson. Without all their work, this also wouldn't be possible. I also want to mention a couple people who were there at the founding too. A key person of which is Dr. Marty Levitt, who also wanted to be with us today. He was the founding librarian who had the idea of something like CNAIR and all these projects that led to CNAIR. It was thanks to his guidance and figuring out ways to do it and getting all the right people together that led to this. And he wasn't able to come with us today, but he wrote up some comments about that he wanted to share with us. And so I'm going to hand it off to Michelle, who's going to read what Marty wanted to share.
All right, so you have me again, but now I'm channeling somebody else. So imagine me about a foot taller and with a beard. Marty was the librarian 2 generations back from me. But he was the librarian that was in place when I first came to the American Philosophical Society as a graduate student doing my dissertation research. So he is someone I have known for a very long time. This is what he wrote. I want to thank the organizers of this conference, especially Michelle McDonald and Brian Carpenter, for giving me the opportunity to send along my best wishes and greetings to all assembled on the 10th anniversary of the official founding of CNAIR. Looking back on the formation of CNAIR, we had high hopes that we were trailblazing, and we were in many ways. But as I look at the conference program, the presenters, the topics, and the quality of scholarship, and the ways APS was able to facilitate this environment, I can admit that 10 years ago, all of this was beyond our wildest aspirations. I'm going to take this opportunity to recognize the founding efforts of so many people who thought CNAIR was not only possible, but that we could lead manuscript repositories in finding newer, more thoughtful ways to make long-held collections of Indigenous materials available to the communities from which they originated. I cannot name them all, though a few must simply be recognized. Brian Carpenter, Keith Thompson, and the late, great Tim Powell. Some of our earliest Native partners, Tom Belt, Larry Aitken, T.J. Holland, Vince Schiffert, and Bob Miller. All were absolutely essential, contributing their efforts on nearly a dozen grant applications, getting our memorandum of understanding into communities that were predisposed, perhaps to be wary and skeptical of well-meaning white guys from an institution that I imagine reeked of privilege and sanctimony in non-Philadelphia places. But I mostly remember the camaraderie, the feeling that literally dozens of people said it couldn't be done, and our joy at each small obstacle succumbing to the combined effort and will of these exceptional founders. That protocols for the treatment of Indigenous materials, co-curation, and digital knowledge sharing were issues that had plagued the Society of American Archivists for decades, but APS was ideally placed to attempt, if alone, if professional consensus was lacking. But in my eagerness to credit the founders of CNAIR, let us not forget that when Patrick Spiro became librarian of the APS, and he was the librarian between me and Marty, he and his superb staff took a nascent center and in 10 years coalesced a program that was a newly realized, ambitious dream, turning it into a paradigm of a center that can convene gatherings of the quality and nature that you are all participating in today. Some of us dreamed of CNAIR, but many other critical figures nurtured it, improved it, and made it happen. The APS has established a precedent that is a model for outreach thanks to the hard work of staff and advisors and Native communities have, judging by the program of this conference, benefited from an enormous leap of faith in our sincerity and ability to realize that dream. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. To all APS staff, to the advisory board, to executive staff, to the Native communities who were willing to take that foundational journey, this conference is the beginning of what you have all wrought in the service of cooperation, collaboration, and useful knowledge. Congratulations to all of you on this 10th anniversary celebration and this awesome display of scholarship and erudition. Welcome. Welcome, friends and colleagues.
And so I also didn't want to have an opening event like this happen without an elder speaking. And Tom Belt was hoping to be with us today, but couldn't make it because of some of the after effects of the Hurricane Helene in western North Carolina. Everyone's okay, but kind of messed up all the roads. We have about we had a conference here in 2010. This kind of got the spark that got all this going. And at that conference, Tim interviewed a bunch of people. And he interviewed Tom a lot and TJ. And I want to put, there's actually a clip. It's 4 minutes long. I like to play it. It speaks to this occasion. And so a little bit of context for it. First, at the very end, you'll hear Tim and TJ at the very end. I think this is a long interview. Maureen Matthews was there too in the room. A lot of conversation back and forth, telling jokes, reflecting on things. So that's the context, but I will let Tom say it in his baritone radio voice that we all envy.
The possibility of these things becoming very, very important to the revitalization of traditional thought and traditional things could be just invaluable, I think. And this is where these kinds of institutions can come in, because they ironically have held these kinds of things for a long period of time. I think that it very well could be the segue, and in some cases could prove to be almost a cathartic thing that would launch a way, and then we would handle it after that. But I think that it very well could be taken like that, provided it's done correctly, provided it's done with the utmost of concern for appropriateness and the integrity of what we're talking about. Such as the case with the recording that I was talking about. It's a very simple recording about simple stories about how he heard things were. But in fact, to the Cherokee, this is a very important thing, both linguistically and also for the fact that it is a reminder of how our people thought, and to us that automatically becomes something that we have to figure out how to carry that on and stuff. It's not something that we remember from a different that we know of that comes from a different time, such as finding a pair of buckled shoes, and thinking, oh, that's cool, and knowing that we will never wear shoes like that ever again. I don't know, maybe if the disco fad comes back, I don't know. But we would never think of initiating that kind of a fad again in shoe wear in this country. But in this case, this is something we may want to try on again. This is something we may want to, it's something we have to remember. So in a kind of a way, to use a metaphor, Ben Franklin's shoes become very, very important to us, because it will teach us how to walk, and it'll teach us what is important about maybe the whole idea of walking. That's a kind of way of looking at that and stuff like that. So yeah, if it's done properly, and if it's done in that manner, and done with, and if it takes in speaking not only the Cherokees but other tribes, if these institutions that have these kinds of things, and that hold these kinds of things, if they can work directly with the tribes with that kind of understanding, I think that we will all benefit from it. I think the institutions will be serving their purpose as stewards of these things. And rather than just housing data and housing artifact, they now begin to house the very kinetic energy that's the soul of our lives and stuff, and can create things with it. Kind of like bringing the dead back to life, or at least in a good way, making sure that life continues on in a manner in which it's supposed to and stuff. And wouldn't it be a wonderful thing for these institutions to help out in those kinds of things? I think it would. I think that would give them a chance to be an intrinsic part of keeping life going, as opposed to just documenting death.
You want to say something about what's wrong? I'm sorry, you're gonna make me follow that.
So if we have any good ideas pushing us here, they're through the guidance of people like Tom and a lot of other folks we've gotten to know over the years. I want to say a few things about the last decade here, as best I can. But I want to start out with one of the things that a lot of people have said, recommended, has said when you meet folks to tell them who you are and to tell some stories, share some stories that carry forward what you're trying to tell. So with that advice, I'll start with that. So my family, my mother's side comes from mostly Scotland and England, and for a time, some of them, when they came to this continent, they stayed for a time in an area near what's now Sarnia First Nation in Ontario, Anishinaabe country, and then moved on to the Puget Sound, to Seattle, which is where I was born and raised, in the lands of Lushootseed-speaking Coast Salish people. On my father's side comes from France and from Norway. The French side goes way back on this continent to Quebec in the 1600s. Someone did a big genealogy 30 years ago, and some of them actually had some encounters with, I think, the Abenakis and Haudenosaunee folks. And then they moved on about 200 years later to Wisconsin, also Anishinaabe country. And then my father's mother's side, the Norwegians, they homesteaded in northern Minnesota in 1899, a town called Grigla, you see up on the left here. Grigla, this is an area that only less than 10 years earlier had been expropriated from the Red Lake Band of Chippewa, and then subsequently was scattered, a lot of it, in the allotment era. You can see some of the remnants of that on a modern map. There's more to say here, but I wanted to share that little bit for what it's worth. I also want to tell stories, and this first one is actually a story from Eric Hemingway on the right here. He's from the Little Traverse Bay bands of Odawa. I asked him if I could share this story, and he said, yeah, he was very enthusiastic. And the idea here is I want to talk about here, kind of going off what Tom was saying about what is this kind of kinetic energy, this potential energy that we're all writing. Well, a lot of it comes from the interactions between people. This all comes down to human interaction. And so along those lines, about 10 years ago, Eric was given a presentation at an academic conference in Philadelphia. I won't say where, but it wasn't a really good experience. The vibe wasn't right. He had some weird questions. He thought, that doesn't matter so much. But after it was over a little bit, someone walked across the room and said, hi, my name is Tim Powell. I really liked your presentation. Never mind all that, all those questions and stuff. do you know about the APS? You should come over. And long story short, Eric did, and he knew quite a lot about the APS, actually stuff about the APS that we didn't know about the APS. Part of it is that the history of the APS and the Odawa goes back 200 years. So Duponceau, who Bob mentioned as one of the early founders of the sort of study of native languages here, who was a linguist, he knew about kind of anyone in the early 1830s, 40s period who was coming through town who was studying native languages. And Eric told us all, everything I'm telling you here is what I learned from Eric. One of those years, this guy named Augustin Hamlin, who was Odawa, he was coming back from Europe. He was a young man then, and Duponceau found out that he was in town. We don't know how he found out, but he found this out. And Duponceau was collecting all these word lists of native languages, mostly from printed sources, and he's got a big book full of them. We'll look at them at the archives tour this afternoon. The only one that has a handwritten thing in there, handwritten word list by a native person, is this one from Augustin Hamlin. Now, Augustin Hamlin, a couple decades later, became the main treaty negotiator for the Odawa with the United States. Fast forward to the 1990s, the Odawa, Little Traverse Bay Band of Odawa had lost their federal recognition in the 1950s, in the termination era, and they got it back. They were one of the first 2 tribes to ever get their recognition reinstated through congressional legislation, because the Odawa said, you know what, we signed treaties with the United States, people like Augustin Hamlin, and they put together archival materials, including archival materials from the APS as key documents in demonstrating that. That's a use of archival documents we had never heard about. We would have known nothing about this. And this is also telling us about how people were trying to access the stuff at the APS for a long time before all the CNAIR stuff started. And so getting to know Eric led to a much broader relationship. We had him here for our digital knowledge sharing symposium in 5 years ago on this stage. And he got to tell a lot of these stories. It's a great talk, you should hear it. I should say Eric is the director of archives and repatriation at his community, at his tribe. He also participated in this relationship led to the first ever, it was a lobby exhibit in the library lobby. This is the first ever directly written, curated text at the APS from a Native community presenting APS materials. We hope to have a lot more of that in the future, but this kind of passed by on the radar screen of our history. I want to bring it back up because I think it's a really important moment. Eric is a great speaker of public history. So all that came about just because someone walked across the room and said, hey, I'm Tim, how's it going? We'd like to work together. So a little bit about what is here at the APS. Within all these, what Tom was talking about the potential energy, the kinetic energy in all these materials, where do they all come from? So I say this to acknowledge that the modern political boundaries of US, Canada, and Mexico don't have any bearing upon indigenous territories, but simply as a geographic shorthand. About a third of the archival materials come from what's now called Canada, about a third come from what's in the United States, and about a third comes from Mexico and Central America. And that latter reason is why we're making a lot of importance on having Spanish interpretation and more outreach to all those audiences. There's also materials from adjacent regions like South America, the Caribbean, Greenland, Micronesia, places in the Pacific, Eastern Siberia. What is the extent? Well, we kind of measure things in how much shelf space there is, 2,700 linear feet-ish. There's many thousands of hours of audio. I haven't done the recent count, honestly. This is my best guess about how much it is. And it's mostly digitized, but we're cranking out some more digitization every month. Photographs, it's really hard to estimate how many photographs. Again, this is also an estimate, but it's kind of an under the radar, underutilized part of the collections I would really like to bring forward, because there's so many stories around photographs. You get to photograph in front of people and the stories come out. There's a lot of also rare and locally printed materials, not just the old books, but like local publications that are hard to find, that are as important and useful as any kind of archival thing. There's definitely more than 500 plus indigenous languages of this hemisphere, these continents. And it goes back to 1553 as the earliest document. We'll look at that at the archives tour. And through this year, we'll look at that thing too. So it's that whole span. I'll skip through this a bit, but yeah, the history of the collections goes back as early as even Ben Franklin, who was a colonial official for the British, and he was present at a lot of the treaty negotiations that were happening in Pennsylvania with the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations, the Lenape, Shawnee, lots of other folks. And he printed these minutes. The same year that he founded the APS, co-founded, he was also publishing these minutes. So our friends at Six Nations have encouraged us to think of our connection going back at least that far, and being an implicit thing we haven't really understood that exists, but it's there, and what do we do about it? There are these word lists that Jefferson wrote down. There's a lot of hidden indigenous authorship in here too. Folks like Little Turtle, a Miami war leader, who wrote it down, I think, at the White House in Washington, D.C. And in the modern more 20th century materials, there's a big upsurge in the amount of materials, especially a lot that comes from anthropology and linguistics, the field notebooks, the audio recordings, that you can kind of imagine all these kinds of things. And here too, there's a lot of hidden indigenous authorship. Folks like George Hunt, Ella Deloria, Archie Finney, lots more. I could come up with a fuller list. And a lot of the more recent things we're seeing too is not just the reuse of the archival materials. People looking at older collections and coming back to the community and talking to people about what's in them, what they think of them, reusing it, creating new materials like audio recordings of these. We'll hear from Maureen and Carol a bit about these photographs from Ojibwe communities in Manitoba and Ontario. Hundreds of hours made talking about these materials, all in Anishinaabe. There's also a lot of laughter in these recordings. It's not all serious stuff, so I want to share that feeling too. And a lot of the new collection area is more about wide ranges of things: born digital materials, oral history interviews, tribal newspapers, artwork, local publications. Hope we can get a little glimpse of that this afternoon too. So when we look at the kind of things that Tom was talking about, there's that potential energy in all of these things. And we kind of think about what a place like the APS is like we're an institution that has all the stuff, and the idea is to bring people into it to learn about it. But I think that's not totally wrong. What we need to think about it is that people already have these relationships with stuff. And the APS kind of assumes that it's involved with those relationships, but we really aren't until we learn about it and talk to people and learn how we can kind of remove the obstacles to access and use of that. So just a little bit of the highlights of what led to CNAIR being founded. There were a lot of work before it even got founded. Digitization projects to figure out what's in the visual materials. I started here in 2008 to help digitize the audio recordings. That was a 6-year project. And in the second half of that, there were our first formal tribal partnerships with Penobscot Nation, Tuscarora Nation, Eastern Band of the Cherokee, and then sort of a consortium of Ojibwe communities, Pemachiwanaki and Leech Lake. That also led to the creation of our protocols for the treatment of indigenous materials. That's what we're talking about here in this photo. And then CNAIR was founded. There was a lot of momentum coming at the library. The APS said, we shouldn't hop around from grant to grant. This should be a permanent part of what the APS does. We had Indigenous Subject Guide project that is now our main way into helping people understand what's in the collections. The endowment that helped CNAIR be a permanent part of what we do. Our Native American Scholars Initiative, a multi-year initiative funded by the Mellon Foundation, fellowships, paid summer internships, digital knowledge sharing projects, and our Indigenous Community Research Fellowships. This is now a permanent funding opportunity. We're going to be sending out some info about the next round of these soon as well. A brief thing I want to talk about is the 2010 conference. Of all that history, I just want to talk about one moment, which was this conference we had in 2010, which was a beautiful May day in 2010. This was the first time the APS had ever done an event and said, you know what, Native people are not the subject matter, they are the constituency, they're the audience. This is the first time the APS had put something together that said, this is, what do you want to do with these materials? Welcoming people in. This is the spark that got all this going, honestly. And there were many historic things happened, including many dignitaries, important people, such as Chief Glenna Wallace from the Eastern Shawnee, who noted that Shawnee had signed treaties with William Penn, and she's glad to be back. I would note that was the second time a Shawnee chief had visited the APS. The first time was in 1797 in the building directly behind her, where there was an impromptu peace conference between the Shawnee, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Choctaws. That's a story unto itself. The rate of growth, when we started out in 2014, we were probably working on an ongoing basis with about 11 communities. Fast forward to now, at any given time, we're working on something with about 60 to 70 places. So the point of this is that this wasn't some great idea that we had to then like convince people of. This is stuff people wanted to do. And we just ride the wave, and we're still riding the wave of that. The changes of Indigenous requests now versus then, we get almost 8 times the amount of requests now in a given year than we did back then. In terms of getting to know new people every year, about 13 times more. This is just one little chart I made some years ago to kind of shows how quickly the requests took off. Again, this was a latent need that people had that wanted to do. And so there's so many things that we've come out of this. I won't talk about all of these, but from our Native American Scholars Initiative, bringing folks here, visiting communities themselves to sort of get to know people in person, folks coming here, and going throughout the continent to see how we can make ourselves useful to all sorts of priorities people have. We're also working on projects to sort of create spaces for Native communities themselves to present materials in ways that they would like to. So we're working on one with the Tunica Biloxi tribe right now that we hope can launch in the near future too, to sort of be a landing page where you want to see everything that's about Tunica that's at the APS. That this is, you don't have to dive and, go into the catalog and type up the right thing. It's all right there for you, and it's presented also with Tunica folks themselves saying what they find is important about it. Digitization, this is one of the biggest things that CNAIR's done over the last decade, over 200,000 scans. A lot of it done by Paul Sutherland and Joe DeLulo. I did a little bit, and Karen Trope, our new reference archivist, is cranking them out too. But it's also photographs and audio. And this is with about 200, this is predominantly for about 200 plus cultural centers and other Indigenous entities. I haven't mentioned it already. The majority of the requests we get, about 2/3, I would say, from the start are from Indigenous communities, whether that's entities or individual people. We also work with scholars, allied scholars, in all sorts of fields as well. That's important. That's something kind of archives already kind of knew how to do. We still learn more how to do it. That's an important piece, but this is all a new thing. So what does that 200 plus look like? Well, It's all over the continent. And this is kind of a cold, abstract way of looking at it, because what I want to convey is come back that the importance, all these dots are relationships or are interactions between people. Some of these are relationships that are flourishing. Some are ones that are unrealized. Some are ones that have lapsed. Some are ones where the ball's in our court and we got to catch up. And there's a lot of other stories. There's some that are relationships that are declined. They're like, you know what, we got what we were looking for, good. And some of them are projects where there isn't anything particular to work on right now, but we stay in touch. And so that looks like me calling up and saying, how are your grandkids? How's your garden going this summer? So those are the kinds of stories that are behind all of these, 202 to be exact. So the idea of this conference is to create a time and a space to get a lot of great people together, virtually and in person, to let ourselves be carried forward by all this kinetic energy, all this potential energy that is there in the past, in the materials, the things that people saw that they wanted to send into the future for people who could hear it, and all the potential energy of between people. And so we have a lot of great talks today and tomorrow with a lot of great people, and I'm just so happy that we're all here together, and I can scarcely believe it, but we look forward to really getting to know each other, and let's get some coffee and take a good break, and we're looking forward to our first session real soon, and thank you very much.